good afternoon to you. Thanks very much at the beginning for joining us at this session, which, as you all have deep interest in, is also becoming one of the important issues to discuss for the Conference of Parties, which is going to be held in Egypt in this year. I represent Climate Trends. Climate Trends is an organization which is working on facilitating these conversations which pertain to climate, energy, environment, clean air, clean mobility, and so forth. If we haven't met before, my name is Aarti Khosla. I'm based in Delhi, and we are a team which is looking at building a narrative, a fact-based narrative on climate change and through Climate Trends and our sister entity called Carbon Copy. Today, I'm quite honored to also have Professor Roona Sarkar, who is joining us and will be co-moderating the session along with me. Thanks very much, Roona, for being here. I'm also joined by my colleagues in Dhaka who have helped put this session together along with our India team, and really pleased to have a collaboration like that going, because it shows that rather than discussing about countries, we really need to open up our frontiers to discuss some of the topics, especially like loss and damage. I don't want to labor too much about what that is because our experts will speak, but I'm quite pleased to welcome Shri Kalyan Murthy Balamurugan from the government of West Bengal, Salim, Dr. Salim ul Haq, who needs no introduction and has been the real champion of the loss and damage debate in the United Nations Framework Convention and in other forums. Thanks a lot, Salim. Harjeet, who has been a voice of the vulnerable in his days of ActionAid and even now in his big boots at Cannes. Thanks very much. Anurag, Dr. Anurag Danda, who, at least as much as I have known him in the last 15 years, has known everything about Sundarbans and the fragile ecosystem and whatever is happening there. I'm sure there is more that Anurag will talk about today as well. I don't see Shreyansh, but I hope he will join. Shreyansh is an expert on finance, works in Accenture, and will add to the debate in terms of the approaches and funding models that could be a solution. And we have Farah Kabir, very pleased to meet you here, Farah, for the first time from ActionAid Bangladesh. I'll mostly say, and before I invite you, Salim, if you allow me, I will just say that in the last 1 week only, we have suddenly seen now, the climate season, so to speak, has started. There is a desire to find landing ground for what will be discussed at the COP. On the one hand, the catastrophic climate impacts are happening, what happened in Pakistan, the rains in India, which are still quite berserk. All of that continues, but that has continued in the last 2 decades as well. And yesterday we saw a very interesting news that the German government, along with some of the developed countries, want to do something to step up action on loss and damage. But at the same time, just the hope that something will bear fruit looks far from reality, just because of the trickiness of the global situation that we are in. At a time when you would expect that the West could declare energy independence, they are again in some kind of poverty, whether it is induced by the war or otherwise. And it just feels like we have taken a few steps back while the vulnerable communities and populations continue to get hard hit everywhere. I would just like to invite you, before we have Roona bring everybody on the panel and get to some discussions on what are the approaches to look at, where should we discuss the focus for this year's COP should be on. What do you think is the reality check that you have on something like loss and damage when actually you know that mitigation goals are going weak, adaptation is still getting dropped from the agenda, and we are talking of a third thing which we cannot mitigate and we cannot adapt. So how real is it to create some kind of a mechanism when the first two have been so difficult and impossible to come to, and we are asking for something which is far more important than them, but also far difficult to deliver. I'll let you set the context and give you about 8 to 10 minutes to speak. Sorry for the for keeping on time. I will not interrupt, but you can end in about 8 to 10 minutes. And after that, I will just allow Roona to take over and go through the rest of the proceedings.
Thank you very much, Aarti, and it's great to see everybody. Thank you for organizing this event and inviting me to speak. So I'm going to very briefly give you my take on where we are with respect to the climate change issue. And in my view, the overwhelming importance is the fact that climate change is already happening. We have entered what I call the era of loss and damage. And you just mentioned a few examples, the floods in Pakistan, the floods in India, floods in Bangladesh, the heat wave in Europe. Every day you watch the news and read the newspapers, you will see right now the state of Florida and Georgia, two whole states have declared emergencies. 2.5 million people have been told to evacuate in the United States of America. It's the biggest Hurricane Ian that they have ever seen. All right. And it's not going to be the biggest by next year and the year after. There will be a bigger one coming. And so we have now entered the era of impacts attributable to human-induced climate change because global temperature has gone above 1.2 degrees. And we are going to have to deal with it, whether we like it or not. Every country, everywhere, but particularly poorer people in poorer countries, and South Asia is one of those. And so we have to know what to do. We have to prepare ourselves better. We have to be ready to deal with the consequences, adapt where we can adapt, but then adaptation is no longer enough. We then have to react and address the problem once it happens. So reality on the ground is by far the most important element, and it happens every day. It's a daily problem, not a once a year going to the COP problem. Okay, once a year going to the COP is no longer the high priority. The second priority after the first one is tackling it where you live, where you are, is showing solidarity across the globe. Neighboring countries in South Asia, we can help each other, talk to each other, work with each other, and we do. In the cyclone warning in the Bay of Bengal, we have a very good system between our countries, helping each other with the warnings. And we can do the same with the floods, etc. So cooperation across borders, neighboring countries, and even global solidarity, working with other countries around the world to share knowledge, share experiences of dealing with the actual problem. So the actual problem of climate change is here now, going to get worse, and is going to be the unfolding emergency of our times. It will eclipse COVID. It will eclipse the Ukraine-Russia war, and we have to be ready for that. And then, at a very third and much less important but less important level, is going to the COP and trying to do something at the COP. We definitely want to do that. We have to use that forum to hold the polluters accountable. Last year in COP 26 in Glasgow, we had a very strong unity amongst the developing countries to push for a finance facility on loss and damage. Unfortunately, we got strong pushback, mainly from the United States, but then other developed countries hiding behind the US. They didn't allow that language to go through, and they gave instead a Glasgow dialogue on finance for loss and damage for 3 years. So they agreed to talk for 3 years, but not do anything for 3 years. Not acceptable. So we have again put forward the proposition to have an agenda item on finance for loss and damage in COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in a few weeks' time. And this has become a much, much bigger issue, particularly since the flood in Pakistan, and particularly since Pakistan chairs the group of G77 and China, all developing countries together. And they put forward this proposal last year in Glasgow before they had the flood. But now that they've had the flood, they have become the biggest champions. And the Prime Minister in the UN General Assembly raised it a few days ago. The Minister for climate change. Shalini Raman is raising it everywhere and saying, time for loss and damage, time for reparations. This is not Pakistan's doing alone. Pakistan has some blame, but not entirely. And climate change caused by polluters have to do something. And so the demand for having this as an agenda item has been provisionally accepted. We will have to fight to get it accepted. And right now, what we are trying to do from all the vulnerable countries side is to make this into a make or break issue. If we fail to get it adopted, which means everybody has to agree to adopt it as an agenda item, and that will happen even before the COP starts officially. You have to agree the agenda before you start the meeting. If they don't agree the agenda, then we will declare COP a failure and say, what's the point of staying in Egypt? We might as well fly home and not stay for the next 2 weeks to talk about things when it's irrelevant. They are not really going to talk about the real issues anymore. And we need to make that threat now. We need to tell the developed countries that if you hold back and you stop this agenda item, we will make it a make or break issue, and we will just withdraw from the COP, and let the Egyptian COP presidency know that, so that they can twist arms. And let me close by just saying that the Europeans are shifting their position. Denmark just announced a fund for loss and damage. So the Europeans want to compromise with us. The US does not. In fact, John Kerry just a few days ago in New York, when he was challenged by Farhana for the US to take, he said no. So our message to the Europeans is you must break from the US. And if the US holds us up, we will hold them to account, but you cannot hide behind them. You must break with them, and let us see what happens. And I'll stop there. Happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Maybe we will we can open the floor for questions, but I'll also pass on to you, Professor Sarkar, on how do you want to carry on with the rest.
Great. Thank you so much. I did see that there was somebody who wanted to ask a question on the question and answer chat box. So I'll request you to go ahead and type in your questions in there. And in the process of our plenary discussion, we'll take questions, if that's all right. So I'm really, really glad to now start our plenary discussions. And I think, thank you, Professor Huq, for setting the context and for making it so clear that this is something that we are going to treat as a make or break issue going forward, because this loss and damage is real. It's real, we are all feeling it. And if we want to do anything about climate change, we've got to start from here. So thank you for bringing that up. On the other hand, I also want to bring up the fact that if we look at Bangladesh as a case study, you will remember that Cyclone Bola, which is, in the 70s, just before Bangladesh obtained its independence, resulted in losses of 50,000 plus lives. It was absolute disaster. Today, when we look at Bangladesh, you look at the cyclone preparedness, you look at the tremendous intensity of cyclones which hit Bangladesh and West Bengal, and then the numbers of people who lose their lives are now in the hundreds at best, if not lower. So, there is very clear evidence that the right kind of approach towards mitigation, towards adaptation, focused, effective approaches are useful. And they are effective and they work. But having said that, what has been seen and seen over and over again is a one-size-fits-all policy does not work. When it comes to loss and damage is a very specific kind of a cost. It's different for different regions. It's, it's livelihood for somebody, it's life for somebody else, and it's just pure physical damage for a third person. And these are the kind of difficulties which make it very hard to quantify loss and damage, to create boundaries within within which loss and damage fall, and then to seek for the right kind of assistance to try and meet these losses. Now, because of this complication, of course, we see that this is an issue which is easily pushed to the back burner. And like it happened in COP26, the issue wasn't really brought up, although everybody recognizes that this is indeed a burning concern. So keeping that in mind, let me start out by inviting Mr. Kalyamurthy Balamurugan to start this panel discussion. Mr. Murugan, as we all know, is the Chief Environment Officer at the Government of West Bengal's Department of Environment. And therefore, there is no better person to let us know how one goes about understanding the extent of loss and damage. You know, how real are these loss and damages for local communities, for example, just within West Bengal? And what type of external and financial technical support do you require to actually ameliorate these kind of losses? I'm sure you've done several estimates at your end, and perhaps if you could share with the rest of the participants your experience in this.
Thanks, Professor Runa, for nice setting up the. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible. Please go ahead.
First of all, I want to thank Climate Trends, Arti and Mrinmay and all the team of Climate Trends, for connecting all of us on and making us, think about such an important issue. As Professor Salimal has already told, what bothers us not just mitigation about climate change. What bothers all of us is the climate injustice happening. Because the poor and vulnerable or the front-end soldiers taking the arrows, taking the loss of life, climate change is starting here. And in West Bengal, for example, there are 7-time increase in number of storm surges and cyclones we are facing compared to 1970s. And there are about twice and 2 times increase in number of drought occurrence we are facing the last 10 years, specifically in places like Purulia, Bankura. So the main issue is like now people have a different perspective. People still, even now, generally, we are not able to connect this thing with the climate change. The disaster management team, the political team, they all approach in a different perspective, and we are not even we are not able to leverage this issue as a climate change and seek fund from the central government. Forget about the international level. So there are certain cases of maladaptation also. Like for example, in Sundarban now the villages are down and the water level is high. Every year, due to siltation of the delta siltation and sea level rise, now we are making like embankments every year, which is a kind of maladaptation. Only very recently our chief minister have told no, we'll go for nature-based solution. Like we have in the last year we have planted about 15 crore of mangrove saplings in the Sundarban region, but that's not enough because we need a place for rehabilitation. It's that place Sundarban is carrying about 45 lakh people, about 4.5 million people. It cannot hold compared to the crisis happening due to climate change, whether it is salinization. They are not able to do agriculture there in Sundarban because of salinization of water and storm surges. And it's not like every home is like concretized. So every flood and storm surge, there's a loss of home, property and lives. So this is a very high time now that number one, we should be having a momentum to connect this with climate change. I underline that. Still now it is not happening. Thanks to Climate Trends for initiating. And then ask for help, technology-wise, financial-wise, all aspects of help we need from national government and from the international governments. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Balamurugan. Thank you for setting the stage and actually helping us recognize that indeed we are so far behind that even the connection that these kinds of events are related to climate change is something where we need to build greater awareness on. So thank you for highlighting this really, really important thing. Let me now go to Mr. Harjeet Singh, Head of Global Political Strategy for Climate Action Network International. And I know that you're a very ardent and very vocal, proponent who talks about losses and damages in the context of climate change. And perhaps you can help us talk about how we could develop an actionable plan to address the challenges that losses and damages put up, and indeed probably address Mr. Rahman's question, which is how do we go about assessing loss and damage? What about the non-economic costs? What about the economic costs? Is there a framework to do it? Over to you, Mr. Singh.
Thank you so much, Professor Sarkar, and thanks to Climate Trends, Aarti and team for having me. Pleasure to join the esteemed panelists here. Before I talk about the action, I just want to put, building on what Salim said, to put the whole issue of loss and damage into perspective. When we talk about the issue of loss and damage, it's a story of 30 years of inaction. It's about injustice and violation of human rights. It is about greed and apathy of rich countries and corporations who have handed death sentence to people who have not caused the problem in the first place. I think let's first understand it's not one of the issues being discussed under climate negotiations, one stream. This is about climate justice. So when we go to these climate conferences, we go there to demand climate justice because this is not an issue that has been caused by majority of developing countries, but they are the ones who are suffering. We can have solutions at the local and national levels, absolutely. And talking of Bangladesh, the way it managed disasters, so far it's a lesson for the whole world, but even Bangladesh is getting overwhelmed. And countries like Philippines, who are known for their disaster management work, are not able to cope. That's where we need to situate the issue of loss and damage, which means this issue cannot be handled within our national borders. We have to go to international forums because a handful of corporations and countries who have caused the problem. And when we talk about solutions, a lot needs to happen at the local level, but we are developing countries. We don't have resources. That's why we are developing countries. We have millions of people to be taken out of poverty to provide jobs. And on top of it, when you see disasters eroding our development gains, making countries now poorer than what they were, Pakistan is a case in point. We have to talk about justice. We have to hold polluters to account. So that's the context we are looking at. And for us, when we go to these climate negotiations as Climate Action Network, that's the litmus test. Because as Salim very rightly said, if this process does not move forward and delivers loss and damage finance, we will call it a failure because it puts a big question mark on the purpose of climate talks, on the purpose of UNFCCC. We don't go there to talk about, how much mitigation you can do, ignoring the question of equity, ignoring the question on what we need to do. Imagine we sitting in those conference centers and those, hallways, talking about mitigation targets and can you update your NDC, forgetting what people are facing in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Africa. We cannot do that. So if this process doesn't help people who are suffering now, how can we trust this system and rich countries who are talking about their 2050 targets, their net zero that's going to happen, 30 years later? No, we cannot trust them. And in any case, we have seen how they have eroded trust by not delivering on their promises on climate finance. And so that's why I say it's a story that we have to look at of 30 years. And the issue of loss and damage is also not new. Island nations could see it coming 30 years ago, but they trusted the system. They trusted rich countries that by focusing on mitigation, we'll be able to deal with it. We looked at adaptation a couple of years later because we thought we can prepare for some of the impacts, but nobody knew that the scale and intensity of impacts will reach a level when this issue becomes most important. And speaking of solutions, and again, how we need to look at it as a global issue, let's talk about the Russian war in Ukraine, how it affected the supply of wheat. India stepped up and said it's going to supply wheat to countries, but suddenly it stopped exports. Why? because of heat wave. It abruptly stopped and said we are only going to meet some of the commitments, but can't take new commitments. So imagine how, that was a case of loss and damage. That was a case of not adapting in advance. So country, and it has happened several times. You know, we saw floods in Thailand affected the whole supply chain. So we are living in a world where our economies, environment, and societies are intertwined. Sorry for the long context setting, but it's important to understand it's not a tiny issue.
No, thank you so much. I think this really helps.
Where we are going to, yeah, it is what we are going to fight for. Now, coming to solutions, what specifically we can do, I think it's really important to first, and thank you, Mr. Murugan, for also saying that majority of people still don't understand and talk about climate change the way we should be doing. This is the work that's needed at the local level. This is our responsibility, even as developing countries. This is where our governments, our local authorities, our civil society and media have to step up to make sure that climate change becomes the central point of our planning process. Because, you know, as Salim said, we are living in a 1.2 degree warmer world. A couple of years ago, we said, oh, we are living in a 0.8 degree warmer world. It's 1.2 now. The recent report, United in Science by WMO, says for the next few years, we will be temporarily reaching 1.5 degrees. What does that mean to our economies? What does that mean to agriculture? What does that mean to infrastructure? All those discussions are absolutely important. All the actions that we take on development need to be informed by the risks posed by climate change at varying levels of warming, and what kind of preparedness do we need. So everything that we do is now going to get affected by climate change and the impacts it's bringing. So yes, awareness is absolutely important. That's where assessment needs to happen. And I'll again emphasize assessment at varying levels of degrees and impacts, and both economic and non-economic impacts. Professor Sarkar, as you rightly started mentioning, because we are talking about loss of life, loss of culture, loss of ecosystems, loss of biodiversity, desertification. You know, we are talking of a range of impacts now. It's mind-boggling. And I totally agree with Mr. Murugan. We are not ready. So we need that discourse. We need to relook at our planning systems, and again, putting communities at the center. Those boardroom plannings, the time for that is over. In any case, we always wanted to put people at the center, and as civil society, that's what we have been demanding. Climate change makes it even more important because they know what they are going through and they have a lot of solutions. Let's also not think that they don't have. Yes, but they need resources, they need more technology, they need finance, and that should be the starting point of our assessment. So I will not take a lot of time and come back again, but yes, the whole planning process has to change now, evolve around people and keeping science in mind so that we can be far more prepared. But I must tell you, our capacities are going to be overwhelmed. That's why connecting our efforts from local to national to international are absolutely fundamental. So we have to fight these fights and be prepared at all levels. So it's not just one part that we can look at and say we'll be able to solve the problem. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And you're absolutely correct when you say it's not any one solution. You need communities, and the solutions have to come from bottom up. And therefore, the need to recognize that solutions would be unique for different regions, depending on the specific challenges that they are facing. And in this context, of course, the entire ecosystem of the Sundarbans, spanning West Bengal and Bangladesh, is unique. And I'm very happy that we have Dr. Danda with us, Director Sundarbans Program of WWF India, who's probably, the person to talk about the Sundarbans, somebody who's literally got his hands dirty, working in sustainable development and nature conservation in the Sundarbans area for at least the last 2 decades. So Dr. Danda, if I may now ask you to shed some light on, what are the real losses and damages on the ground in the Sundarbans that you see across India and Bangladesh? And in this context, where exactly is South Asia situated in this L&D debate? How many solutions can come up from the grassroots? What are the solutions that have actually emerged that are real? And which are the solutions that actually need more financial assistance or technological support? Over to you.
Thank you, Professor Sarkar. Thank you to Climate Trends. It's a pleasure to be here with Professor Salimul Haq, Harjeet, and Mr. Bala Murugan and the others. Thank you for this opportunity. Runa, coming back to directly to what have been the losses and damages in a place or a region that is, in any case, fragile, like the Sundarbans. Damages are more apparent. We see them every time there is an event which is kind of catastrophic. You referred to in your opening remarks about the Ebola incident. Since then, we've reduced the loss of lives. Yes, undoubtedly. Have we reduced damage? Not necessarily. Have we been able, are we better at rebuilding lives? Not necessarily. Yeah. And we don't even need catastrophic events for losses to occur. There are, I mean, Harjeet was on Mosami Island a few years ago, and he saw for himself how people were losing their land and their livelihoods. South Asian societies are, still very traditional societies. We have traditional occupations in our agrarian systems. So somebody who comes from a farming background and has traditionally been a farmer and eventually loses all the land that his family had, it's not only an economic loss, it's much more. So these are the losses. One is very difficult to make good just through, bringing in money. A farming family that cannot, grow its own food and have the necessary security in terms of grain is a loss of esteem, a loss of standing in the society, a loss of face to his or her own family members. These are losses to me that are very difficult to quantify and also to address. The other challenge, that is becoming all the more apparent, that even very small events, you just mentioned about depression in the middle of August, and then we also saw a low pressure regime in the Bay of Bengal just 2 weeks ago. These have very localized impacts, but given yes, Sundarbans is known for its ecosystem, for its mangroves and the mangrove tiger and so on and so forth. But the region also harbors, as Mr. Balmorgan pointed out, 4.5 million people. Far too many on the Indian side. This is a population density. We have a concept called census towns in India, where we define even rural areas depending on the size of the village in terms demographically and the number of people who are engaged in non-agricultural activities and so forth. All of Indian Sundarbans is census town. So that's the kind of density we are looking at. And so even very small events have fairly large impacts. And even if we look within the state of West Bengal, the kind of impact an event will have in the Sundarbans as opposed to what it will have in Kolkata is different. Contributing to the problem, obviously the people of the Sundarbans did not contribute to the problem. Harjeet talked very strongly about justice at the international level. To me, justice also has to be domestically, demanded for. People of the Sundarbans did not contribute to the situation that they find themselves in. People like Runa, you and me, sitting in Kolkata, contributed to it to a much greater extent. Now, when we talk at the international forum, we talk about as nations. But look at the diversity for a nation like India, or even for that matter, United States. The state of Louisiana and the state of New York are not the same. Their contribution to the problem is not the same. This is far more pronounced in our case. Where on the one side we have the Ambanis and the Adanis, we also have the people of the Sundarbans. And the other loss is, I will not want to, I don't think it should qualify as damage, is the loss of ecosystem services. because of the, again, slow onset changes that the ecosystem is undergoing. There are species that are mobile, are moving out of the area that were of commercial significance to the people of the Sundarbans. Now, yes, you can quantify in terms of economic terms, but somebody who has known crab hunting all his or her life and a certain kind of crabs disappear, what does this person do? Right. So it's, again, not necessarily economic loss, and how do we deal with it? And I also saw a question amongst the participants who wanted to know if we have a framework. So to my mind, yes, we've made, yes, 30 years is a little too long to be where we are, but at least now we have countries like Denmark saying that, okay, we will put some change in the hat to get the conversation going. But we still have a long way to go. Even if, supposing we did have a pot of money, how do we go about distributing the pot of money? Who gets how much? For what? You mentioned about the PM CARES fund being some kind of a national fund. But again, you look at the way it is being administered, leaves a lot to be desired. I'll stop here for the time being. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Danda. Thank you for raising those very, very relevant issues and also reminding us how far, what a long road we still have to take before we can even start addressing the issues of loss and damage. So, starting from not even being able to connect loss and damage to climate change, we are not even in a situation where there actually is a good enough framework to make assessments of what constitutes loss and damage. I will turn to Professor Haq. You of course set the context brilliantly for us here, but now I was hoping that given the fact that you will be representing, the cause, if you will, of loss and damage at the COP27 in Egypt, what kind of proposals are you planning to take forward over there? What kind of, how do you intend to address, for example, the concerns that countries like the US and some of the countries in the EU raise each time the issue of loss and damage come? Professor Haq, are you there or? All right, so instead, ma'am, Ms. Kabir, if I can please, call on you. I'm very happy that Ms. Farah Kabir has agreed to join us today. She's with ActionAid. She's the country director of ActionAid, and she's been working in this field of development and research over the last 2 decades. So clearly you are somebody who is in the know of these issues. And as somebody who's working in a human rights-based development organization, which has a footprint across the world, what would your expectations from this COP be in the context of loss and damage? Do you expect that actually things will move as we are hoping? And what would be required to enable loss and damage financing? Well, how would Bangladesh, or how could Bangladesh play a role in this? Over to you, ma'am.
Ooh, Professor Sarkar, that's a lot packed into, but thank you so much for inviting me. I'm also honored to be part of this panel and to join climate advocates. And Harjeet and I, we were in the same journey, and I think we kept harping on the justice issue for years. And before I respond to you, I just want to share a little bit that if your question is to me about COP. Now, my first COP was in Bali, 2007. And we made a point of involving the community. And, actually working approach is women leadership in emergency, women-led, we never considered them as just a vulnerable group, but as an agency. So the first person who went to Bali with me, my first COP and her, was someone from the shores of Pabna. And Akhtar Banu and I, she is an 8th or 9th class graduate, and she went there, and she's in the front line. She's facing it every day. So there was this panel of the World Bank and development partners, and they were discussing about the I's and the T's and how the negotiation should proceed. So at one point she wanted to speak, and she said, okay, now every night when I go to bed, anyway, she lives in a mud house with a thatch roof. And so she was saying that I live near the river. And when I go to bed, I don't know which part of my house is going to be lost to river erosion. I have already moved 26 times. So can you please tell me what you're discussing and how it's going to change my life? So this is my first exposure to COP, and this was in Bali. And then our whole one thing was very clear, that I joined a development organization, but all our efforts were being diluted or almost wiped away because of the constant disasters. I am in Bangladesh, which is a lower riparian, it's in a delta, and every time we are trying to achieve something, change something, it gets washed away because of the disaster, because of the frequency of the disaster. And the extreme weather started affecting the very communities with whom I was working. So it became very clear to me that I have to try and understand this whole thing about climate change. And I'm not a scientist, but try and read, and also how it impacts, and learn from the communities. So that's why I continued going to the COP. Now, today, everyone is jumping around and reacting to the floods in Pakistan. But please let me remind you, there was horrible floods in Pakistan 2010. And people just glazed over it, right? In 2014, we were in Poland for the COP. And as we stood there was the hurricanes in the Philippines. The Philippines minister, he left that, he appealed and then he left. And the whole world was, oh my God, what's happening to Philippines? But just as he was talking about the Philippines, the UN CCCAD process representative was talking to the coal lobby. And Ajit and ourselves, we were all out there demanding that, you can't be encouraging the fossil lobby. You have to ask them for accountability. So the COP process is influenced by those 5 or 7 handful polluters. And so now come to Glasgow. There was an expectation that we would reach somewhere, because loss and damage is not something that can be put up away. It's happening to everybody on the front line every day. So the facility was almost there, but overnight, and Salim would be in a better position to tell you how the negotiators flipped and it became a dialogue. What are we dialoguing on? Because when I have to move 26 times in the chores of Bhola, or I become a displaced migrant in the slums of Chittagong and Dhaka, Sundarbans, I have to, the bee collectors, we've heard a lot about Sundarbans, and I was there working with communities there. The bee collectors have lost, they're being challenged. The fisher folks are being challenged. The agriculture farmers, they're being challenged. So everyone is being affected in many ways. Now, my expectation from COP27 would also be that we all come together and say that it's a make or break. I don't think we have the luxury now of looking at how to negotiate on 1 or 2 issues, or how to kind of adjust and accommodate. When we kept the issue of women and gender justice and we took it to the COPs, what did they give us? Women-friendly stoves. But there was no finances to look at the impact on women and girls as a result of climate change. We celebrated the women-friendly stoves. Wow, it's something, it's innovative, it's technology. Let's take it back home, and every country went there. But we have not addressed how the women and girls are being impacted. Look at the number of floods that happen in 1 month. In Sylhet, in Sunamganj, in 120 years, they have not seen such a flood. Twice in 1 month. The girls can't go to school. The boys can't go to school. The girls are being married off, early child marriage, because there's no food, there's no water. Look at what's happening in the Horn of Africa. There's no food, there's no water. So when we go to COP, I think my expectations are minimal. I'm now looking at expectations from us, that we have to come together as a solid force and make that demand. Now, it's a negotiation of parties. And if you don't have the pink badge, you're basically left outside. And the UNFCCC process is not democratic. Let's not fool ourselves. It's not democratic. It's not inclusive. It is dominated by its members. And they celebrate by, okay, we'll let you come and you do your actions outside. You civil society space. What is the level of inclusion? Civil society space. The first week you do all this. We're not at the negotiations. We're not even in that hall. And so we then have to start at home with a national. And so the second part of your question, I think we have in Bangladesh, the civil society, the academia, been very active and managed to influence our political actors. How good they are or how well it is being implemented, that's for another day. We can definitely critique that. But at least ActionAid and ICCCAD, Salim and I, after coming from Paris, we started putting the loss and damage conversation on the agenda of the government. And of course, Salim is a scientist and he's a different kind of an influencer. So he's kept on with it and we try. And we brought the evidence from the ground, because often we are told, what do you mean? Give us evidence, show us how it's related. So loss and damage has been picked up. Finally, it took from 2016 to last year, but we didn't give up. And so it is on the agenda of the government. The government, if you observe at the UNGA or at other sessions, even in Glasgow, they raised it. And it's here in Bangladesh also, they're talking about it. Bangladesh has a history of having put up its own climate fund. Again, I'm saying that the concept and the policy we are able to influence. And it goes back to 2008 when the trust fund was set up. How it is implemented, is it all working? Not necessarily. But then I can't even put all the blame on the national government, because we are constantly being impacted by the disasters and at a level where it's difficult to keep our head above the water, literally. In many of the communities, it's difficult to keep our head above the water. We are constantly being challenged. So development practices and all these other initiatives are suffering. Then I just want, my last bit would be, because I am a diehard climate and gender advocate, that whatever we talk about on loss and damage, we must bring the gender dimension, the intersectionality of it, but the differentiated impact as far as gender is concerned, as far as the young people are concerned. When they can't go to school for years and years, when they lose their livelihood, they don't have safe drinking water, they're suffering from health issues. When the women in the Sunamganj now have reproductive health issues, they have UTI problem, they have gender-based violence, the men are going away, there's polygamy. Then how do we replace this? I can build the building, but can I build the social capital that is being lost? Can I bring the childhood for the 14-year-old? Because who has been displaced and so on. So this is why we all need to come together again on the issues of gender sensitive loss and damage, both policy, the facility and finance. And lastly, if we do come up with a financial arrangement or a grant fund arrangement, it must be accessible. It can't be for the banks. I still laugh over when I remember that after we talked about the Green Climate Fund and we were at the COP, the Germans were saying, but we are making a contribution. Oh, are you making a contribution? How are you making it? Well, we have put the Green Fund to orient our bankers to learn about climate change. So that was the first year of Green Climate Fund. And that's how they told us that this is how we are spending Green Climate Fund. We should not get too excited about the commitments that we made in the last couple of weeks, because everyone is trying to be on the bandwagon. What does this 13 million from Denmark mean? Australia is falling behind. And if Australia does beef up its contributions, it's on the basis of their geopolitics, which is going to be the Pacific. If Europe is looking at increasing their contribution, it's because they've themselves been suffering, or it is because of their geopolitical priority. We know that the US is still dragging its feet, and then China has its own. So we are in the squeeze between all this. The only option for us is to be in solidarity as one force calling for loss and damage. Action around loss and damage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kabir. Thank you for, in some senses, tempering our optimism. Because I think in some senses, even Harjeet Singh tried to talk about exactly that when he said, you know, can we really have faith in the people who said they would be mitigating this? And really, we haven't seen too much of benefits there. I'm really happy that Shreyansh has joined us. Shreyansh Jain is with Accenture. And, you know, the kind of concerns that we've been talking about, Shreyansh, is we recognize that loss and damage is really, really important. And we recognize that it's real, it's there, it's urgent. And yet, what are the, you know, challenges because of which developing the right kind of financing mechanisms around loss and damage have not really happened? So what are those challenges? What are the ideas that you have that could actually create the right kind of mechanisms that perhaps could be proposed at the COP27 as methods through which we can start thinking about formalizing a loss and damage fund and its administration? And of course, Ms. Kabir has, you would have overheard some of the things that she talked about, things like ensuring that the issue of gender is kept into mind, the issue of accessibility, and so on. So we already got some principles along which to work, but keeping those principles in mind, what can you tell us about some financing mechanisms? Over to you, Shreyansh.
Thank you, Professor Sarkar, and a very warm good afternoon to all my fellow panelists and participants. So I would start by saying that when we say loss and damage is a climate justice issue, this itself is a strong enough reason for developed countries to act. And I believe as a sustainability practitioner that developed countries cannot just turn a blind eye to the atlas of human suffering that they have been leaving behind in the developing world. At the same time, I think why such mechanisms fail to fly is because when we talk of loss and damage finance facility, the immediate thing that comes to mind is that the developed countries are being asked to pay some kind of climate reparation, when that is not the case. Because this kind of an international financing mechanism should be looked at as a way to save scarce resources of developing countries from increasingly being diverted towards humanitarian relief and recovery. And in this, one would not expect developed countries to turn blind eye or look the other way to hide their own culpability on climate inaction. Unfortunately, what we have seen in the past is that even the largely symbolic $100 billion in climate finance, which developed countries have pledged to deliver annually by 2020, that has not been achieved. And we are in fact nowhere close to even reaching half of that particular mark. So now comes the real question that how can such a facility be structured and financed? I'll try to clear some misconceptions about loss and damage being confused with terms like humanitarian aid or disaster risk reduction finance. So one has to first clearly understand that loss and damage finance is different from mitigation and adaptation finance. While adaptation finance contributes to minimizing loss and damage, mitigation finance contributes to averting loss and damage. And loss and damage finance is therefore a third dimension, and it typically includes the adverse impact of human-induced climate change that can neither be avoided nor be averted by mitigation or adaptation. So loss and damage finance cannot be also characterized as disaster risk reduction, or it cannot be classified as humanitarian aid. So the confusion here is that while developed countries definitely fall short of their commitments, they try to greenwash or inflate their commitments by confusing loss and damage finance by these terms, because humanitarian aid is an immediate response to a disaster, and it is short-lived and it addresses only a situation-specific need. Whereas when we talk of loss and damage, it is essentially about cooperation, like Ms. Kabir mentioned. So it's based on solidarity and it focuses on meeting the needs of communities to current and future impacts. So as a sustainability practitioner, when I look at financing such a facility, I would look at some of the key factors. Firstly, any such financing mechanism to fund loss and damage should have a system of classification that should be able to identify in very clear terms the rapid onset events like floods, cyclones, etc., because they merit an urgent response. And it should be able to distinguish the other slow onset events, which merit a graded response. And this response could be in the form of technical assistance or capacity building support, loss and damage planning, or even policy framework development. Secondly, for such a facility to become operational, I think what is also needed is a mutually acceptable methodology for measurement and quantification of loss and damage. So which is currently not in place. We do have a EU taxonomy that provides some guidance on which activities to be classified as climate friendly or green, but we don't have any such methodology that can help a country to quantify its loss and damage. So if we have such a methodology in place, it should be able to clearly determine the operational boundary and the time horizon of aggregating such losses. But what we see in practice, however, is that developed countries try to club development finance with climate finance and count private finance as financial support, which I strongly disagree with, because private non-grant capital, by virtue of its commercial orientation, cannot be termed as international finance, nor can development assistance that is provided through development finance institutions or even multilateral banks, that also cannot be classified as climate finance. Because loss and damage finance must be new, it should be incremental, and it should only comprise the grant equivalent element of any claim disbursement. Finally, to come to the last part of your question, that how do we kind of finance such a facility? So to start with, I think such a facility should definitely be guided by the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities under the convention. And we can also maybe look at the existing mechanisms like adaptation fund, GCF, GF as possible vehicles that can be mandated to fund loss and damage activities. So in a way, instead of creating a new financial mechanism or creating a new investment vehicle, I think it would be more prudent to piggyback on the existing tested models that are already in place. What is needed here is the capacity building of the accredited entities. So because these are the ones who are responsible for appraising the projects on loss and damage. So if something can be done to kind of build capacity of these accredited entities, I think this particular issue can definitely be taken care of. And lastly, I would say at an operational level, what can be more beneficial would be to follow a blended finance approach to sustain this facility, because it will not only help in pooling capital, but it will also put developed countries in a less incriminating position. So while I do appreciate the passions that were expressed by some of the panelists about inaction of the developed countries, ultimately one cannot directly pin the blame on the other and say that now you have to pay me a compensation. So naming and shaming any country is not going to bring in the scale of funds required to fund loss and damage. I think blended capital, blended finance approaches would be a more suitable way, because if say we can blend grant or grant equivalent with something like commercial debt. So I think the borrowing country, a country like Bangladesh, India or Pakistan, which requires that huge quantum of funds, it can actually use that grant equivalent element to subvent the cost of commercial capital. So in a way, it can utilize some portion of the grant that is being made available, while at the same time try to capitalize it by borrowing commercial capital at much cheaper rates. So this is how I would like to put it.
Thank you so much, Shreyansh. It was a lot of material, but very nicely structured. This is definitely going to set the tone for the discussions going forward. And Professor Haq, I'll have some questions for you, primarily because I do know you need to leave. So thank you for staying on this long. But before we do that, I just want to direct our panelists' attention to the two questions that have come up in the question and answer box. One related to, the fact that we've lost, so the Sundarbans has lost over 400 square kilometers of land over the last 100 years. And there is some information about the World Bank extending their support against this loss and damage. And I'm not sure what Mr. Dipendra Chaudhary is referring to. He may be referring again to adaptation assistance, but nevertheless, if somebody has the answer for that, do think about it. And there's another question about the status of the Halliday Wildlife Sanctuary in the Sundarbans. So if you could kind of think about those questions while I move on to Professor Haq, who set the context for this discussion so beautifully and said that this is an urgent matter and we have to make sure that it gets, that COP27 gets up and takes notice of this no matter what. My first question to you is, confirming that now this is definitely an agenda item at COP. Is that's confirmed? And if yes, then based on the discussion that we've had so far, what would your expectations be from a discussion of this matter at COP27? What kind of outcomes would you expect?
Thank you very much, Professor Sarkar. To answer your question, it is a provisional agenda item at the moment. It is not yet adopted. It will have to be adopted at the very beginning of the COP. And I am anticipating that there may be some countries, particularly the US, who will oppose adoption. And any decision in the COP has to be by consensus. So one country disagreeing means we don't have agreement. Mm-hmm. And what I said earlier is that we, the developing countries, should not accept that. If it fails to get adopted, we should raise this as a make or break as far as we're concerned and say, what is the point of staying here if you cannot even acknowledge the reality of loss and damage and the need to address it with some finance? All right. So I don't think people will walk out, but the threat of a walkout is a viable proposition. We can threaten that we will walk out, and that will get their attention. So let us then assume that it gets adopted. Then we have the hard work of negotiating. What do we mean? The negotiations that we've had so far, and many discussions that are taking place informally, we get a lot of pushback from the developed countries on the word facility. They say, what do you mean by facility? Is it a new facility or an existing one? Where will it be? Who will give the money? Who will manage it? All legitimate questions. But whenever I get involved in any of these discussions, I tell them, your questions about the facility are good. We'll deal with them. But it's the second word with the facilities is the word finance. There's no question about finance. It means put your hand in your pocket and come up with $1, €1, yen, something. You have not done that. None of you have done that. And that's what the question is. Come up with something, and then we'll discuss how to manage it. And as you may have seen, Denmark has recently announced some money. They have agreed. They've told us where they're putting it. They're putting into this thing called the Global Shield that has been proposed by Germany. It's a bit vague. We're not quite sure what it means, what it's going to do, but it's something. Let us have those discussions. But if you fail to even adopt it as an agenda item for discussion, then to me that is simply making the COP redundant, and we can say the UNFCCC is not fit for purpose anymore. But if they do adopt it and agree to it, then we have hard negotiation. There'll be lots of questions, that's for sure. But we will discuss them as we have done in the past. We have done these discussions before. We have created other facilities, the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund. It's not impossible to design something that may be fit for purpose. The question, though, is about the magnitude of the money. The magnitude of the requirement is now many times the 100 billion that was agreed a long time ago. and that wasn't achieved yet. But that's a different story and a different phase of the argument. At this point in time, it is simply the principle. Should they pay for loss and damage or not? And they don't want to pay, and we must make them pay. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Harjeet, you have your hand up. I think you have a perspective on this as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Kar. Suja, just as Salim said, the first fight is about putting it on the agenda. And the subsequent fights are making sure that the agenda is substantive and not just a checkbox exercise, so that we are able to have those in-depth discussions, exactly what Salim said, answering those questions. And John Kerry had the audacity to say that we only have 6 weeks, completely ignoring we gave them 30 years to talk about it, and 10 years as under Warsaw International Mechanism to actually pin down some of those things on how money is to be raised, and they consistently blocked it. And I've seen it myself, because I've attended almost every meeting of executive committee. So I know how they were arm twisting and bullying, so that there is no discussion on loss and damage finance. Now, coming to Shreyan's presentation. So I do agree with him on a couple of things, but I need to clarify when he talked about climate reparations. So I'm glad you talked about the culpability of rich countries. But let me just put things into perspective when we talk about climate reparations and why these terms or compensation will keep coming up. Because that's what it is. Somebody has destroyed my home, and that person is obligated to apologize and help repair that home. So it is about reparations. It is about compensation. So let's not say it's not. It is. However, when we go to these international spaces, as Salim said, UNFCCC is a place where you agree on a consensus basis. We will never be able to land that language. So, and the reason UN was created is to have a world which is based on international cooperation and solidarity. We believe in that. And developing countries trusted rich countries in 2012 in Doha and stopped using the word compensation and liability, so that we can have a mechanism based on solidarity and international cooperation. That's exactly the reason Warsaw International Mechanism was created in 2013. We have a clear function on action and support, which is about finance, technology, and capacity building. But Shreyan's, not a single penny has been provided under that cooperative system. So we trusted rich countries, So when my home is destroyed, somebody comes to me and says, borrow money from me or take blended finance to rebuild your home, and I'm going to watch and I'm going to make your life miserable even to get that money. How would I feel? So it is a matter of justice. So, I mean, I know you come from a financial sector, so you will use that language. So I don't blame you for that. But I think it's also important to recognize it is a matter of justice. But we, as civil society, as developing countries, are very well on board to find a cooperative mechanism. That's why we keep going to these UN systems. But rich countries have been failing. And see who's making money right now? Fossil fuel companies. Windfall profits, obscene amount of money that they have earned. And on the other hand, people are suffering. Fossil fuel companies have caused the problem in the first place. Why are we not talking about them? So when we say we need to make polluters pay, we need to call spade a spade. We will keep calling, but come to a mechanism because we don't want to live in a world where countries are suing each other for justice. But that's exactly what is going to happen if we don't get a system at UNFCCC. So just to be clear on
you're absolutely correct that the UN gives you this opportunity to discuss things in a multilateral forum and therefore avoids, if you will, the bullying. So it's important that we continue to engage in that multilateral forum no matter what. But coming back to the two very specific questions that we had, Dr. Danda or Mr. Balamurugan, if you would like to comment on those two, so that, go ahead, Mr. Please. Thank you.
Yeah, before I attempt to answer his question, first I want to touch on your question, like how are we going to pressurize? How are we going to pressurize the developed countries, to think about loss and damage, and how are they going to compensate? I think based on what has happened before, sorry about this, I'm getting a call. So based on what has happened before, there is less credibility about the developed countries that they would be willing to pay, be it their Paris Agreement, whatever they have promised to reduce the mitigation, whatever they have promised to reduce the greenhouse gas emission, that has not been done. You all know it, a young person from Sweden, Greta Thunberg, have questioned this towards the world. What are we doing? We speak about emission reduction and we are doing nothing. So same manner regarding CDM or RED+, there are very less projects that has been finalized and people have got money from the developed countries. So in this background, if you just think that they are going to consider the loss and damage, it is not going to happen unless, number one, B, the South Asian countries, developing countries have a strong forum to negotiate. Number two, we should have evidence and data to prove that these are all the disasters which are all not natural, which are caused by climate change, and people are suffering out of this. I want to raise this point as number one. Number two, coming to the question raised, yeah, good news is yes, World Bank has a project, as a 300 crore rupees project for integrated coastal management, which has been going on, which is done by the Environment Department. And some good works have already been started in the last 3 years. But that 300 crore is not enough. It is a good start. We need more fund. We need more technology. We need more resources to save people in the coastal zone of West Bengal. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Danda, do you want to comment on the status of the Halliday Wildlife Sanctuary?
Okay. To begin with, it was already a very small sanctuary. It kind of befuddles me as to, why was it designated as a wildlife sanctuary in the first place. But nevertheless, it was. And that it is getting smaller is also a fact. Unless, we actively manage our ecosystem in this region, we will lose, and we are already losing. I also saw a comment where somebody said, we've lost 400 square kilometers on the Indian side over a number of years. Yes, because see, essentially the Sundarbans is, the very last bit of the Ganga Delta and the Brahmaputra Delta. And Ganga, being what it is, one of the most intervened rivers in the world, brings very little fresh water and silt. Yeah. So the Ganga Delta part of both Bangladesh, southwestern part of Bangladesh, and the Indian part of Sundarbans is kind of undergoing shrinkage. It will, right? And Halliday is very much part of that system. So the Delta is undergoing a change, and we see it. So we have to actively manage the space if we, want to retain this ecosystem and value the, ecosystem services that we derive out of that place. As of now, both in Bangladesh and in India, it is essentially protection that we are providing to a designated space. We call them sanctuaries, we call them World Heritage Site, Ramsar Site, and so on and so forth. But neither of the countries are actively managing space. Unless we do that, and again, when it comes to loss and damage, it is not only people. Actively managing that space will also need money, right? And we'll have to find it somewhere, and through this stream possibly, because it's a loss that will occur. Sundarbans is unlike any other mangrove ecosystem in the world. So if it is gone, it's gone for good. And the other thing is, Mr. Bala Murugan hinted, but did not expressly say that we will have to retreat from certain places in the Sundarbans. Who will pay for this retreat? Is it within the capacity of the government of West Bengal to pay for this? Is it within the capacity of the government of India? In Bangladesh, there has been a project, a German supported project for a number of years, where they've been strengthening some of the cities so that the slums that get overwhelmed by these climate migrants can be improved upon, so that the lives can be improved upon. Now, 47 slums in all of Bangladesh is, again, a few coins in the hat. But we will have to find money to be able to do all of this. Yeah, so thanks.
Thank you so much. Ms. Kabir, you have your hand up. Please go ahead. You would see that there were some questions in the question and answer block which are probably are questions that you could address, but please go ahead. In case you don't address them, I'll raise them again.
Oh, I had raised my hand after listening to Mr. Jain. And
right. No, go ahead.
Harjeet has addressed that, so I will not go there. But I think, yeah, that's, I have no qualms about calling a polluter a polluter. So among ourselves, let's be very clear on that. And I think we were trying to be politically correct and nice for a long time. So let's get, you know, the people who are suffering, who are in the front line, for them, we owe it to them. There's no more discussion about being politically correct. It's action time. And I think one of the things that has happened is, again, from the civil society advocacy, particularly from Bangladesh, we now have the UN Special Rapporteur for climate, for human rights and climate justice. And there is the UN Special Rapporteur for internally displaced people. There is also for gender-based violence. So my call in the last couple of weeks has been that the UN rapporteurs also need to coordinate and come together. By creating this special rapporteur and the reports, it goes to, you know, the climate change and the human rights and climate justice rapporteur. He came, first country he visited was Bangladesh. He has seen on the ground the implications, and he will report. He has reported, I think, to the UNGA, but his main report will come out in May 2023. So it takes me back to my initial question. While we totally initial response that we agree that the UN space is the only space we have, but it's not necessarily democratic. So we'll also have to keep working with our governments and to make sure that there is this level of accountability. Now, I will come to the gender question because somebody has put it there. But before that, I was listening to Dr. Dunn and I was thinking about my, you know, I'm not a scientist, I'm not any of those things, just someone who is there with the community. And on the Sundarbans, and a country like ours suffers from energy deficit. And therefore, our political actors keep coming up with these projects. And one of the projects was in around the Sundarbans, and we have heavily protested, but the government of India and the government of Bangladesh, without the EIA, without anything, with the private sector, is setting up that code. And we need the environmental actors, the climate justice actors to also work on your side to demand that this is going to impact on the Sundarbans. And Sundarban is not just about our national boundaries. It goes way beyond that. The specimens, the biodiversity loss is a loss for humanity. So I just wanted to flag that. Somebody has expressed a bit of pessimism that, you know, women and the communities are the most affected, but there's only talk. Yes. There's a lot more talk than action. But if you go around different countries, there is recognition that climate change does impact women, the marginalized, the persons with disability in a differentiated manner. Now, we have the UN Convention for the people with disability. We have the Convention for Women's Rights. We have for children. But these are not being acted upon. So what do? We then bring it down to the national level. And we try to see whether the national policies this is happening. Now, I can speak for my country that Bangladesh has a climate change gender action plan, has the Mujib Prosperity Plan, has the Delta, 100-year Delta plan. And this morning, Salim and I, we were there trying to talk with the, speak to and learn from the bureaucrats or the implementers. And this is a process where we'll have to keep harping on the differentiated impact. Now, the person who's asked the question also has to take into context that what is the reality in the society we live in? What are the practices, but what are the discriminatory laws that exist? And what have we done about that? Because in access to resources for women, for the marginalized, is constantly being, is not there. And if it is there, it is not being practiced, right? So then we have to act at the national level. We know about women's inheritance law being a serious problem in my country because of it being a part of the personal law. You know, while the Constitution gives all of us equal rights when it comes to inheritance, custody, marriage, divorce, it's a personal law. So if you're from a Hindu community, you're ruled by Hindu law. If you're from the Muslim community, it's Sharia law. So this is where we need to bring in the change. And unless we bring the change, the climate change is an opportunity to bring that change, but it's not going to happen by itself. These are processes that must go on simultaneously. We have to look at the budget. Like we do annual budget analysis, gender budget analysis, and climate change budget analysis. Our budget does not plan the way it should to take up these issues of where women and girls are being impacted, where there should be more investment. That's at the national level. If you go to the global level, and if you look at the funding that comes, everyone talks about women's economic empowerment. If you study the funding that is coming from FCDOD, Canadians are much better, but Australians and everyone, you will find that the investment is very minimal. And despite the commitments of since Beijing, we have not really seen a serious move for investment to change the status of women, girls, marginalized people. So gender funding is really not enough. It's only 4%, I think. And I think in recent times, we saw some reports that it'll take us 200 years to catch up on the gender gap. So come on, world, society, country, are you serious about 50% of your population? So the activist in me is very angry. But the reality, the pragmatism is that I have to work with political actors. I can't go there and change everything. So we all have to keep harping on these issues. And the other thing that we hear about, and I'm sure when we go for the finance facilities, there'll be a lot of discussion. There has to be financial accountability. There has to be financial governance. There has to be infrastructure for these organizations to get that finance. The women in Sundarbans, what kind of structure and financial accountability and what will you have? So do I have to go through the World Bank to get that money? Is the World Bank giving that money for the purpose, or is it going to give me concessional loans? I don't need concessional loans. It's my right now. It's a right to life for me. You should be giving me the money as grants, or you should be investing as grants. So any investor that talks to me or says that this is, we are doing charity, we're doing you a favor by putting up this facility, I'm sorry, I have issues there. So I think this is where we also have to keep our eyes and ears open, that when we go for this loss and damage and the facility, that it doesn't end up being concessional offers from the World Bank and the ADBs and such financial institutions. It's a separate funding, accountable mechanism, and it should prioritize those who are impacted.
Thank you so much. I know Dr. Haq is in a hurry to leave, and there is you would notice there's a specific question for you, which is related to addressing governance issues while ensuring developed countries are held accountable at the COP. Also, two other concerns that I thought you'd be in the best position to answer. There's an interesting question whether there are different positions of loss and damage within the developing countries, and also how we are or what kind of preparedness do we have to address this issue as a regional bloc? Where is South Asia on this?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me take the last one first. In the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, South Asia is not a recognized grouping. We are in the region, we have SAARC as the South Asia Cooperation Council, but that's not a recognized body. So in the negotiations, each of the countries belong to various different subgroups. For example, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Maldives, we belong to the group of least developed countries. India is not part of that, or Pakistan. And then there are other groups like the Small Island Developing States, AOSIS, and then there are the BRICS and the LMDC. So there are many different subgroups, but we all come together in the big group of developing countries called the Group of 77 in China. The number is not 77 anymore. It was when they formed. It's now 136 countries, so all developing countries. So in that big group, we are all together. And that big group is currently chaired by Pakistan, as I mentioned. And so the big group has a very common position. In fact, the demand for the climate, loss and damage finance facility is from the entire group. And when Pakistan put forward this demand in Glasgow at COP26, it was in the text, in the final draft text, near the very end, where we demand a Glasgow facility on finance for loss and damage. And then the COP did not end on time. It nowadays hardly ever ends on time. It was supposed to have ended, Friday evening of the second week after 2 whole weeks of negotiations. But then the COP president, Alok Sharma, said, we haven't finished. We're going to take another extra day. Please go home and sleep and come back again tomorrow, Saturday afternoon. We will have the final text. So we did that. We went home, we came back, and a lot of our delegates had to fly home. They weren't able to stay the extra day. This is actually a tactic, a negotiating tactic to get rid of us, in my view. But nevertheless, we stayed extra day. We came back and we were given a take it or leave it text. This is it. And the text had changed to, we shall have a Glasgow dialogue on finance for loss and damage. And this dialogue will continue for 3 years, not just a 1-year dialogue, 3 whole years. And that's it, take it or leave it. We had to take it. We unfortunately were not in a position to play hardball at that point in time, and we accepted it, but we did it very, very reluctantly. And this dialogue has actually started. It's basically a talk shop. They had a meeting in Germany in June. Harjit and I were both there. It was a nice talk shop, lots of talk, but it doesn't have any outcome. It doesn't even have a decision attached to it, and it will continue for 3 years. And that's really what John Kerry is referring to. John Kerry, in his response, was saying, we'll talk about it for 3 years, and then we'll decide after 3 years. That's his position at the moment. And that was his doing, by the way, getting that language in. And so the developing countries under Pakistan's leadership have again applied to have it as an agenda item in COP27. It wasn't an agenda item, by the way. By the way, loss and damage is not a standing agenda item. It doesn't come up every year. It came up last year because of the review of the Warsaw International Mechanism, but it doesn't come up every year. That's what we are demanding. We are saying it should come up every year. And in COP27, we want it to be on the agenda. The good news is that the Egyptian presidency and the UNFCCC Secretariat have accepted it on the provisional agenda. So now the developed countries who don't want it have to throw it out. And that's where we want to challenge them. We'll say the vast majority of countries want it, and we want to know who are the countries who are going to oppose it. And we will name and shame them. There's not much more we can do in the UNFCCC, unfortunately, except naming and shaming. But naming and shaming does have some leverage. It can be, to some extent, effective, because people don't like to be the enemy, the bad guys. And Joe Biden does not want to be a bad guy, okay? So let's make him the bad guy. In the beginning, we said he's good guy because he's not Trump. But now he's, becoming a bad guy now. So let us threaten to say you are the bad guy if you don't agree to this. And I think we can get away with it. Let's see.
So the difficult question, are there different positions on loss and damage within the developing country bloc?
A little bit. I would say, there is a bit of a internal discussion from people. And I actually remember this from way back when I started working on adaptation, more than 2 decades ago. And I talked about adaptation, nobody wanted to hear about adaptation. It was all mitigation. And when I said, but you have to do adaptation also, they said, don't talk about adaptation, then they won't do mitigation. I said, they're not doing mitigation, but we're going to have to talk about adaptation. You're not going to be able to avoid it. And now we've won that argument. It's the same with loss and damage. Some people, those of us particularly wanting to get more funding for adaptation, say, don't ask for loss and damage finance because we won't get for adaptation. I said, you're not getting for adaptation anyway. So we're not going to stop asking. We must ask.
Absolutely. Dr. Danda needs to step out also very soon. So I'm going to ask you to, of course, you do realize that we are now seamlessly, if you will, into the question answer sessions. So we are happy to, because of a very, very vibrant set of participants asking really useful questions. There's a very young person out there, all of 15 years old, and he wants to know, how can youth like us work in the future in this context of loss and damage and climate? And I thought, Dr. Danda, you'd be a right person who's been involved in this literally all his life to tell us a little more about that.
Professor Sarkar, I would like Professor Huck to answer this because, when I was much younger, he was the inspiration. Yeah, so he was the inspiration. So he might as well be the inspiration for a 15-year-old. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for passing the buck, Dr. Danda. But I'm happy to take it. I'm happy to take it, because I quite often get asked the question, how do I keep up my optimism and my enthusiasm for what seems to be a losing battle? And my optimism comes from young people. I really do believe that they will make the world different and better than we have. Unfortunately, we have not done a good job. Our generation, adults of today, but our children have the future in their hands and can do it. And I'm very closely associated or support the Fridays for Future program that, every Friday the school kids come out inspired by Greta Thunberg, but now many other young activists have come up all over the world in developing countries as well. And last Friday, the 23rd, the whole world, all the kids around the world came out in a campaign for loss and damage. It was a very well coordinated global campaign to promote the idea of finance for loss and damage. And interestingly, one of the things that has happened is that the group of vulnerable countries called the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which is 55 countries altogether, and their finance ministers have created a new loss and damage fund of their own, with their own money and with contributions from a number of philanthropies. And they are now opening up that fund for crowdfunding, contributions from anybody, anywhere. And they will be doing a campaign to raise funding to provide finance for loss and damage. And the idea would be to give small grants to communities that are actually suffering the impacts of climate change, like the communities in Sindh province in Pakistan, for example. Get some quick money quickly to them. That is really the essence of this. The problem that other ideas that are being floated, like the German Global Shield, is it will take years for them to design something, and the first euro or first dollar will not come for 5 years. And that's not good enough. The people are suffering today, and we know who they are. So nobody's going to question, why did you choose Pakistan? Just send some money to the people in Pakistan immediately, and then Mozambique, and then the victims are self-evident. Nobody's going to say you make a big analysis of who should get the money first. You just look at the newspaper and say, today we are going to give somebody, this country has been affected. Let's find some group in that country, a community, and give it to that community. So the idea is to fast track small to medium amounts of funds to the communities that are being impacted by climate impacts right now, immediately, to give them some relief to build their lives back after the flood.
Thank you so much, Professor. So that kind of, I hope, Yudhishthir, you have some ideas on the way forward for you. I'd like to open this up to Mr. Harjeet Singh, because there were some specific questions addressed to you regarding concerns whether there'd actually be a cut in climate funding. Here we are talking about extra funding for L&D, and there's a concern whether there'd be a cut in climate funding. What's your take on that?
Well, there are already cuts happening, and we see that rich countries are not meeting their commitments of climate finance. And this is not the only year. Every year they have some excuse or the other. So it's just that now you say, oh, now you have this crisis, otherwise you had some other crisis. But look at, when they want to mobilize money, they can mobilize billions and trillions for war. So even again, John Kerry saying, do we have trillions? Yes, you have trillions. When you want to fund a war, you have trillions. When you want to bail out banks, you have trillions. But you don't want to give even billions when people are suffering and losing their lives. So money is there. It's about the political will. It's about priorities. And they have not met their ODA commitments for decades now. So it's not only this crisis. Any crisis can be an excuse. But speaking of people, right now, everybody is suffering because of the increase in food and energy crisis. That should not become an excuse for rich countries to say their own citizens are suffering. In fact, that should be a cause for empathy, to understand that now people in the rich world are suffering. And just imagine what developing countries and people there are going through when they're losing their homes, farms, and income. So I think it should create more empathy than apathy. So that is important. And you know how to raise money. Tax fossil fuel companies. We have been saying it for years. UN Secretary General said that tax their windfall profits, give that money for loss and damage, give that money for people who are facing energy and food crisis. So money is there. It's about how to channel that money. Now the other question was also around separate funding. Did not separate fund this year. What is expected? So one thing to clarify on facility, we are not asking that the fund is going to be established and money starts coming in through that this year itself. So we have provided, and that's the paper that you circulated, Gunjan, thank you for that. So that CAN paper clearly talks about this year, you agree on the facility, and this is what we did with Green Climate Fund. Next year you work on, so with broad functions, you do that. Next year you work on operational modalities, and third year you operationalize it, which also is in line with Glasgow Dialogue, to make that Glasgow Dialogue meaningful and not just empty talk. And the third question, very quickly, on last year, it was not mentioned, as Salim, Farah, everybody said, we were very close to getting that. And that's because of the unity. This year, we are going with a lot more preparation. We have a lot more clarity. We know what we are asking for. There was a heads of delegation meeting in Cairo early this month, just on loss and damage. It has never happened. Heads of delegations from all key countries flying to Cairo, the capital of incoming presidency, to discuss only loss and damage. And I was invited to make an intervention in the opening plenary, which is also rare. Civil society is invited to speak to empty chairs. So I was invited to speak to when they were about to begin their conversation. So there are things changing, and the incoming presidency does show the seriousness. So I think we are looking at something very different. And again, onus is on us to make it as big as possible. And yeah, I'm sorry, we will be doing a lot of naming and shaming. It's important. Shreyans, you also do that when you do rating of companies. What is that? It's naming and shaming. It works. It works. So I think let's go with that.
That's a way of earning money, I would say. That's our bread and butter.
And there you are. Even here, we are looking for money for loss and damage.
So then why can't we name and shame for justice if people can use name and shame for making money? So I think it's well within our right.
So we'll continue to put you on the mat, Shreyansh.
Yeah, I think
you are our numbers guy. So if you can kind of tell us about, yeah, go ahead.
Only limited point I wanted to make here was the quantum of funds required is so huge that no country is just going to commit to that amount as a grant. No country is going to say, okay, you take trillions from me because you are suffering, and therefore I'm going to finance you for free. That is just not going to happen. So what I intended to say was, we need to have these kinds of grant funding available as much as we can, and let's try to blend it with the commercially available capital, so that if I as a sovereign am trying to minimize the losses or the damages that are happening in my country, I have those required resources to kind of undo those damages. But to say I'll go at an international forum and name and shame a particular country, and that would be sufficient to kind of let them empathize with us and say, okay, here you take X% of my GDP and go and finance your loss and damage. That is just not going to happen. Coming to the question that you shared with me in the chat, what is the current extent of loss and damage? So I would answer by saying that we do not really have a universally acceptable methodology to quantify loss and damage. Different countries would definitely take different positions on the scale of damage that has happened in their geographies. And the primary intention is to say, quote X amount, then only you will get some percentage of it. So, and that is where the whole disagreement happens. As Professor Huck mentioned, the pot of money is the same. Ultimately, be it USA, be it any European country, they have a prescribed fund or proportion in mind which they are going to deliver as a grant to the developing world. It only depends on which agenda is dominating in that particular year. So if it is mitigation that is at the top, they will come out and say, okay, we are champions of mitigation, we'll fund mitigation this year. Next year, you will name and shame them, they will fund adaptation. And perhaps after COP27, they might come again and say, okay, now is the time to fund loss and damage. So what we need is a very watertight mechanism to quantify loss and damage, and this should be agreeable to all the stakeholders involved. I think that would be the best way forward to kind of go out in the developed world and then let them tell why would they not be interested in financing or undoing the damage that they have incurred in the developing world.
Indeed, thank you so much for that, Shreyansh. And there is a last question, which is a concern that in this polarized world, as more and more of the democracies are leaning towards the right, what would the impact be, or would lobbying and intervention even matter? And in this context, I think what Harjeet has talked about is very, very important, that indeed he was given a seat at the table to address everybody when it mattered, right in the beginning of a plenary discussion. So I do still see hope in it. I know some of our panelists need to drop out now, and I must thank each of them. But before we actually conclude this session, let's think about a situation that and I just need one-line answers from most of you. Let's think about a situation where L&D is on the agenda at COP27. What are the specific issues, just a couple of words from each, that we definitely want to discuss? We'll start off with Professor Huck and then move to Dr. Danda, and then I'll continue. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much. So I think what we need to do is to fast track the agreements on what can be done. And I am personally not wedded to one solution for everything. I am quite open to having a multiplicity of ways to deliver it, but my preference would be something under the UNFCCC, where all of us have some level of governance over it. If you farm it out to another organization, a World Bank, let us say, or the Green Climate Fund, then we lose control. They then are in charge, they do things, they don't do things. We don't really have any say in it. So in order for us to have a say, it should be under the UNFCCC. But anything to start things off is fine with me. Thank you.
Dr. Danda?
Yeah, thank you. See, while this is happening and we are seeing incremental movements, we're seeing empathy, Harjeet addressing the plenary, we also need to get prepared. Supposing this does happen, then what do we do within the countries, within the regions, at the subnational levels? So that preparation needs to happen internally. When Mr. I think Balamurugan was speaking, he said people don't even understand that there are connections between impact of climate change. So that homework also needs to happen. Otherwise, even if that money materializes, we will end up spending it for various other things than addressing the challenge head on.
So doing our homework is important. Ms. Kabir, followed by Mr. Balamurugan.
I think we need to work for enhancing the ambition and ensuring that these funds are there, and also build on the work that is going on, because I had earlier mentioned from 2016 in Bangladesh we had started talking about climate loss and damage, and also trying to develop a mechanism. So I'm sure there are other countries, so we can bring that up in terms of that. But the most important thing here is also that there is accountability, transparency and accountability. It doesn't get lost in the whole negotiation process and then we wait for another year or 3 years. So this is where we have to work together. I go back to my point of we need to come together, the solidarity, the cooperation, and the one voice.
Absolutely, the whole regional cooperation. Shreyansh, after Mr. Balamurugan, please. So Mr. Balamurugan first, followed by Shreyansh.
Thank you. I want to make 2 points. Number one, this climate fund is credible only it reaches till the rural bank. Imagine I live in a drought-prone area or a flood-prone area. I live in Sundarban. I got my property lost or some damage. If I'm able to access some kind of loan or fund from a nearest bank showing some evidence, if I'm able to get some fund to rebuild myself, then that is credible that we have all done something, then it is successful, be it GCF or GRIF or whatever name we may be for that climate fund. Number one. Number two, I agree with Farah in one important point she raised, that the apathy of climate change is not gender neutral. Whenever there is a increase in flooding or drought, we can see in West Bengal there is increased number of even human trafficking. Girl child being moving to some places in the name of for work or something. So the situation is so huge, it's a crisis. So we have to have a strong consensus to quantify this and go with the polluter pay principle and ask fund for rebuilding. Thank you.
All right, great.
Thank you.
Shreyansh.
Yeah, so if I were to look at this new loss and damage financing facility, what I would want embedded in the new structure would be some kind of a graded mechanism. So there should be certain milestones that should be that a country who is receiving this kind of funding should be able to project to the outside world that, okay, I am able to attain some kind of tangible benefits out of it, and therefore I deserve more so that I can lessen the suffering that is there in the country because of your deeds. So I think if this kind of a mechanism can be embedded into the facility, it would really meet the purpose.
Great. Of course, Harjeet, you have the last word.
Thank you so much. Just to say that when we talk about loss and damage finance, again, it's about justice. It's about the world that we want to create. We can't see a situation where polluters are making more money and people are dying because of what they did earlier and what they are doing now. And it's also about the kind of world we want to create. In a world where people show compassion, empathy, and support each other and not sue each other. So of course, we will always talk about those principles, but in the end, we would like to see more international cooperation and solidarity around the world. That's the kind of world we want to create. And if we don't address that, we can't think of even other strands of climate action. Imagine if people have lost their homes, you cannot talk to them about solar panels and wind farms and the next crop, right? They've lost everything. So addressing loss and damage is not only a necessity, but also not only about human rights, but also a practical necessity to make sure that we are together in this.
Absolutely. So thank you so much. And this is the benefit of having such a plural set of specialists talking about the same issue. Indeed, the time has come where we are not going to, using Ms. Kabir's words, adjust and accommodate anymore. Loss and damage is real. It's about understanding that this is about climate justice. This is about reparations that need to be made here and now. However, in order to make it, we need to have credible mechanisms. We need to have mechanisms which are accountable, which are graded, so that the typical criticisms that come in from the developed world can be countered. There is so much that we can discuss if this agenda actually comes up in the COP, and we certainly, given all the positive vibes we have seen, we do believe it will be there, and we do believe that it will be the beginning of figuring out both a mechanism to actually account for the loss and damage, as well as a mechanism to account for how to finance that loss and damage. Both these issues will come up going forward. I will stop here. I know I've gone beyond my time, and I must thank Ms. Gunjan Jain, and everybody else from Climate Trends for making such an important webinar happen. Over to you, Ms. Jain.
Thank you, Runa, and nothing much to say, but just to thank all our panelists and participants who've joined. Special thanks to you, Professor Huck and ICCCAD for partnering with us on this session. Could not have been possible to bring this together without all of you and this very important issue which has been highlighted today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
joining.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
stay well.
And a big
Bye-bye.
thank you to the participants. I must say, fantastic questions from all of you. Thank you.
Yes.
So much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.